Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, August 31st, 2023. President Joe Biden declares a major disaster in Florida to make federal money available for the cleanup and recovery after Hurricane Idalia. We'll get the latest from the president at FEMA headquarters in Washington and from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in Tallahassee. Also from Congressman Buddy Carter of Georgia about hurricane damage in his state. Former President Donald Trump pleads not guilty to charges in Georgia of trying to overturn the 2020 election results in that state, opting out of an in-person arraignment that would have happened next week. As Georgia Governor Kemp rules out calling a special legislative session to impeach the District Attorney Fani Willis, as Donald Trump and his allies have been calling for. U.S. Capitol physician says that Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell is medically cleared to continue working after yesterday's incident in which Senator McConnell stopped speaking while answering reporters' questions for about half a minute. The Capitol physician says occasional lightheadedness is not uncommon in concussion recovery and can also be expected as a result of dehydration. Today is the 2-year anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. We get perspectives from Republican Senator Joni Ernst and the Pentagon press secretary. Health and Human Services Department is recommending marijuana be reclassified from a basically outlawed Schedule 1 drug to a more permissive Schedule 3. We'll talk about what that means with Politico's cannabis policy reporter, Natalie Furtig. And emotions in Tennessee running high as a special legislative session ends this week without major gun violence prevention legislation as Democrats wanted, and Republicans did not. We'll check in with Tennessean state government and politics reporter Melissa Brown. WSB-TV in Sarasota, Florida reports that President Joe Biden on Thursday approved a federal disaster declaration to help state and local recovery efforts after the Category 3 Hurricane Idalia slammed into North Florida's Big Bend region and caused widespread damage. The federal declaration opens the door to such assistance as grants for temporary housing and home repairs and low-cost loans to cover uninsured property losses, the White House says. Also money available to the state, local governments, and certain nonprofit organizations for emergency work, and money for hazard mitigation measures statewide. Governor DeSantis had requested a major disaster declaration for 25 counties. The initial approval from the White House is for 7, but it says that more could be added after the assessments. President Biden today went to FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Yesterday, I convened the entire cabinet for a long meeting to make sure that we had a whole of government response. Every single cabinet agency has some contribution they can make and some responsibility. And I'm here at FEMA today. Just a few minutes ago, I received a call from your administrator and Criswell, and who's in Florida, and helping them recover, at least doing the initial assessment of that Category 3 storm that made landfill. And this morning I spoke again. It seems like we should be on direct dial, the two of us, Governor DeSantis and I. We spoke again this morning. I let him know that I approved his major disaster declaration, and I also spoke with Governor McMaster's and with the for South Carolina's emergency declaration as well. And I spoke the day before to the governors of not just Florida and South Carolina, but of North Carolina as well as Georgia. And look, it means we're making available federal assistance for Florida survivors whose homes are damaged or destroyed by the declaration that I agreed to. And we're helping both Florida and South Carolina with the delivery of meals, waters, and debris removal that's going to help both states begin their road to recovery and do it immediately. But before we do anything, I'm here to thank all of you, and I really mean this. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You are making an incredible contribution. I mean, I hope the American people have a sense of, and it's hard to understand it because, you know, we usually we're not this engaged this often. But this last couple of years with climate change and really kicking in, you guys are going 24 hours a day and 365 days a year. And it seems to just keep piling up. And I mean it sincerely. I I admire what you do. I've been in almost every one of the areas you're talking about that you've had to deal with. And your brothers and sister organizations, from the Coast Guard, the military, I mean, across the board. It's amazing the sacrifices, and I might add, risks your folks are taking out in the field. And so thank you, thank you, thank you. It's important the American people understand it, because we're in a situation where, you know, how can I say it? There's still some deniers out there in terms of whether or not climate change has anything to do with any of this. And we're going to need a whole hell of a lot more money to deal with emergency appropriations, to deal with all you're taking care of. And on behalf of the country, I want to deliver the heartfelt thanks to the emergency personnel in our communities all across the federal government, including right here, all of you in front of me, FEMA's National Response Coordination Center, and those out on Maui. You know, it's amazing. You've seen it. Some of you have been there. It's just pure devastation. That whole part of the island is just leveled. There's nothing left. And before this week's storm, we pre-deployed 1,500 federal personnel and Coast Guard throughout the Southeast. Federal search and rescue teams have been helping people whose homes have been surrounded and inundated by water. And FEMA and the Small Business Administration are on the ground to help residents whose homes and businesses have been destroyed or damaged. And I want to, again, thank you all. It really, really, really matters. And one more thing. Every American expects FEMA will show up. And when they're in the middle of a disaster, and I'm calling on Congress to make sure you're able and have the funds to be able to continue to show up and meet the needs of the American people to deal with immediate crises that we're facing right now, as well as the long-term commitments that we have to make to finish the job in Maui and elsewhere.
President Biden at FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C. He said he plans to go to Florida on Saturday. Governor Ron DeSantis gave an update on hurricane recovery in an early morning news conference in Tallahassee.
There's still reports rolling in, but as of last night, there were approximately 40 successful rescues made, including 29 by the Florida National Guard. Our Fish and Wildlife officers assisted with the medical evacuation yesterday, and they are conducting high water and welfare checks. These efforts are continuing, and they will continue until there is no longer a need. We are working hard to restore power across the state of Florida. As of 6 a.m. today, there are approximately 146,000 power outages reported across the state, but power is being restored quickly. Thus far, 420,000 accounts that lost power during the storm have been restored. And the bulk of the outages at this point are in that Big Bend region, a lot of the rural counties that bore the brunt of the storm. And those are counties that will have co-ops, and they are working to accept the mutual aid from the linemen that we have. All the linemen that were here, the tens of thousands, they are here still. They have not been released, and they're going to be working on particularly that area to get people back. There's parts of it that are 100% out, like in Taylor County, and so that is priority number one, to start getting those reconnected. Now, some of that stuff may require more than just connecting the power lines. If you have real significant structural damage, if there's damage to a substation, that requires a little bit more. But Kevin will probably provide a little bit of an update on that. But the reality is we've got a lot of people on the ground, and this is a really, really big priority. Also, priority has been clearing impacted roadways. Florida Department of Transportation, has cleared the vast majority of impacted roadways. All state bridges, including the Cedar Key Bridge, have been cleared, and that happened within 12 hours of landfall. So we really appreciate them doing that. The 15-mile stretch of I-10 that was closed yesterday in Madison County was cleared and reopened last night, and so that is open today going forward. We have requested from the federal government a major disaster declaration for all 25 counties that fell under the hurricane warning. This will allow us to start debris removal and will provide funding for individual assistance, which includes shelter and temporary housing for impacted individuals.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis at the State Emergency Operations Center in Tallahassee, Florida, early this morning, and he submitted that request. The major disaster declaration came from the White House initially for 7 counties. Governor DeSantis joined by Deanne Criswell, head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, before the two went out to tour some of the heavily damaged areas. The website poweroutage.us said that over 300,000 homes and businesses are still without power along the U.S. East Coast from Florida to North Carolina. Because after the hurricane swept across the northern half of Florida on Wednesday as a Category 3, it then hit Georgia and South Carolina as a Category 1 and tropical storm. C-SPAN spoke by phone this morning with Congressman Buddy Carter, Republican from Georgia. He represents the 1st Congressional District. That's much of the southeastern part of Georgia and the entire Atlantic coastal area.
Well, we're recovering. It was a rough day yesterday. It didn't really turn out quite as bad as we had anticipated, which is good news. We did have a lot of flooding. We did have strong winds, and people think just because you don't have a tornado that you don't have strong winds. Nothing could be further from the truth. You still have gusts of winds, and that in itself can cause a lot of problems. We did have quite a bit, as I say, of trees down, and that was probably the biggest obstacle we had to overcome. Power is out. I'm at my home right now. Our power has been out for about 24 hours now, and that's the one thing that we're trying to recover from, is to get everyone's power back on. But tragically, we lost one life that we know of. It was in Valdosta in Lowndes County. A tree fell on a vehicle and killed someone, and certainly our thoughts and prayers go out to that family. But all in all, we'll assess the damage now. We have to look at erosion is always a problem, particularly at the beach. Keep in mind that we're in the midst of the full moon, therefore we have higher tides right now, so that's really a concern. But as we assess the damage and we get back to what is going to be normal, we'll see how things turn out.
We know that there's an emergency funding measure working its way through Congress that you're going to take a look at when you get back here to D.C. That one from the Biden administration previous, a lot of it to fires and previous disasters. But is there going to be additional money needed for natural disaster recovery? And do you think Congress is going to approve that kind of money?
Yes and yes. Yes, there is going to be more money, additional money that is needed. We've had quite a few natural disasters here in the United States this year, probably more than we had anticipated. And yes, we are going to fund it. That is the one question I've been asked, I think, more from the media than any other, and that is, what about FEMA funding, or is it going to be there? We've had all the disasters throughout the country. It has depleted the money in FEMA. Are you going to restore that money? And the answer is yes, we are. We're going to make sure that people are taken care of. That should not be a worry. It should be the least of people's worries. We're going to do our job, and we're going to make sure that the funds are available to help people recover.
Congressman Buddy Carter, Republican from Georgia, interviewed on C-SPAN's Washington Journal program this morning. The Atlantic hurricane season started on June 1st and runs through the end of November. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, earlier this month updated its prediction for this season from named storms, originally 12 to 17, the new estimate 14 to 21. From Fox News, former President Donald Trump pleaded not guilty to charges in his election interference case in Georgia on Thursday. He chose to waive a formal arraignment appearance and instead pleaded not guilty in a court filing. The Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis charged Donald Trump and 18 others for allegedly attempting to subvert the results of the 2020 presidential election in Georgia. Several of the other co-defendants in this case have also pleaded not guilty already, waiving an in-person arraignment. The others will be arraigned, scheduled for September 6th. Georgia Senator Colton Moore, Republican, has sent a letter to Governor Brian Kemp, also Republican, requesting a special legislative session to impeach the district attorney. Governor Kemp telling reporters today that despite his personal thoughts about these indictments, he does not have the power to call a special session.
I did want to take just a few minutes to speak to some history that's trying to repeat itself over the last few days here in Georgia. Many of you will recall that in the final weeks of 2020, I clearly and repeatedly said that I would not be calling a special session of the General Assembly to overturn the 2020 election results because such an action would have been unconstitutional. It was that simple. Fast forward today, nearly 3 years later, memories are fading fast. There have been calls by one individual in the General Assembly and echoed outside of these walls by the former president for a special session that would ignore current Georgia law and directly interfere with the proceedings of a separate but equal branch of government. Now, my concerns with the Fulton County District Attorney's handling of this case and the special purpose grand jury have been well documented. We are now seeing what happens when prosecutors move forward with highly charged indictments and trials in the middle of an election. Simply put, it sows distrust and provides easy pickings for those who see the district attorney's action as guided by politics. But let me be clear. We have a law in the state of Georgia that clearly outlines the legal steps that can be taken if constituents believe their local prosecutors are violating their oath by engaging in unethical or illegal behavior. Up to this point, I have not seen any evidence that DA Willis's actions or lack thereof warrant action by the Prosecuting Attorney Oversight Commission. But that will ultimately be a decision that the commission will make. Regardless, in my mind, a special session of the General Assembly to end run around this law is not feasible and may ultimately prove to be unconstitutional. The bottom line is that in the state of Georgia, as long as I'm governor, we're going to follow the law and the Constitution, regardless of who it helps or harms politically.
Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, a Republican, at a news conference in Atlanta. The news conference not called specifically on this topic. He was there mostly to talk about Hurricane Idalia recovery. From Associated Press, a former organizer of the far-right Proud Boys extremist group was sentenced on Thursday to 17 years in prison for spearheading an attack on the U.S. Capitol to prevent the peaceful transfer of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden after the 2020 presidential election. The sentence for Joseph Biggs is the second longest among hundreds of Capitol riot cases so far, after the 18-year prison sentence for Oath Keepers founder Stuart Rhodes. Federal prosecutors had recommended a 33-year prison sentence for Joseph Biggs. Dr. Brian Monahan, attending physician at the U.S. Capitol, has put out a statement following the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell's incident yesterday in Kentucky, where he froze for about a half a minute while answering a reporter's question. Second time this has happened in recent months. Dr. Monahan's statement reads, "I've consulted with Leader McConnell and conferred with his neurology team. After evaluating yesterday's incident, I have informed Leader McConnell that he is medically clear to continue with his schedule as planned. Occasional lightheadedness is not uncommon in concussion recovery and can also be expected as a result of dehydration." President Biden was asked about Senator McConnell today.
Spoken to Leader McConnell?
Yes, I have. I spoke to Mitch. He's a friend, and I spoke to him today, and he was his old self on the telephone, and having a little understanding of dealing with neurosurgeons and people, and one of the leading women in my staff, her husband's a neurosurgeon as well. It's not at all unusual to have the response that sometimes happens to Mitch when you've had a severe concussion. It's part of the recovery. And so I'm confident he's going to be back to his old self.
Biden, do you have any concerns about his ability to do his job? Do you have any concerns about his ability?
I don't.
President Biden taking reporters' questions today during his visit to FEMA headquarters, and the Senate does return from its August break next Tuesday. This is Washington Today. The EFE news site reports the de facto Afghan government of the Taliban marked the second anniversary of the withdrawal of foreign soldiers with silence and no loud celebration, unlike last year. 2 years ago on this day, the U.S. ended nearly 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history, after the plane carrying the last Americans, including troops and civilian workers, took off from Kabul just after midnight on August 31st. Last year, the Taliban government celebrated the day to mark Afghanistan's freedom from American occupation. The government declared August 31st a public holiday across the country in 2022, but this year, silence stood out and no fanfare and gun salutes. That was from EFE News. U.S. Senator Joni Ernst posting a video on this anniversary criticizing how President Biden handled the withdrawal.
2 years ago, we witnessed President Biden's disastrous retreat from Afghanistan. The whole world witnessed chaos at its highest level. Service members killed, partners deserted, Americans abandoned, billions of military equipment and tactical vehicles handed over to terrorists, and $1 trillion worth of rare earth and critical minerals vital to utilities and technologies that we use every single day, left to the Taliban. In a moment, President Biden displayed complete and total weakness. Since then, we've seen one of the most disastrous foreign policies of any administration in my lifetime. As Russia continues its march on Ukraine, China grows closer by the day to launching an attack on Taiwan, and Iran is days from a nuclear weapon. President Biden consistently appeases and kowtows to our adversaries. Under the Biden administration's failed leadership, America and the world are less safe, no question. Our enemies are emboldened, and the safety and security of our partners and our homeland is uncertain. On this 2-year anniversary of Biden's haphazard and disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, we must reaffirm our commitment to strengthening the United States. We must honor the heroes, like Corporal Dagan William Tyler Page from Montgomery County, Iowa, who gave their lives for the sake of freedom and protection. Instead of displaying weakness on the world stage, we must not leave our own behind, abandon our allies, or signal to the world that the United States of America is anything less than resilient.
Senator Joni Ernst, Republican from Iowa, posting that video. The Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder also making a statement today on this second anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Today marks 2 years since the end of the war in Afghanistan. As you may have seen, Secretary Austin released a statement earlier today in which he highlighted the valor, patriotism, and selflessness of the American service members and civilians who fought and served in Afghanistan over the course of 20 years. The Secretary underscored the service and sacrifice of those we lost, stating, quote, "We bow our heads today in memory of the 2,461 U.S. service members who never made it home, including the 13 courageous troops taken from us in the attack at Abbey Gate in the final hours of the war. We also remember the hundreds of service members from allied and partner countries who lost their lives during this 20-year war," end quote. In closing, Secretary Austin emphasizes that the war in Afghanistan is over, but our gratitude to the Americans who fought there is unending. The full statement can be found on the DoD website.
The Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder, also an Air Force Brigadier General, at the start of his news conference today at the Pentagon. A story from Fox News, Congressman Darrell Issa, a Republican from California, says that House Republicans could threaten to withhold funding for certain programs as part of a broader effort to get answers for families who lost loved ones in the 2021 Abbey Gate terror attack in Afghanistan. Congressman Issa telling a Fox News Digital, "It's a very effective tool. We don't want to use it indiscriminately, but these families deserve answers." The Pentagon Press Secretary also announcing today a new website on unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs, what used to be called UFOs. It's a place, this website, where U.S. government and military personnel can report their own sightings, and the public can get updates on investigations.
The department is launching a website on the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office to provide the public with information concerning AARO and its efforts to understand and resolve unidentified anomalous phenomena. This website will provide information, including videos and photos, on resolved UAP cases as they're declassified and approved for public release. The website's other content includes reporting trends and frequently asked questions section, as well as links to official reports, transcripts, press releases, and other resources that the public may find useful. The department is committed to transparency with the American people on RO's work on UAPs. The website will serve as a one-stop shop for all publicly available information related to ARROW and UAP, and ARROW will regularly update the website with its most recent activities and findings as new information is cleared for public release. You can see ARROW's new website at www.aaro.mil.
Pentagon Press Secretary and Air Force Brigadier General Pat Ryder at a Pentagon news conference. An article at space.com says that in a frequently asked questions section of the new site, ARROW, All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, states that it uses a rigorous scientific framework and data-driven approach to better understand UAP and will follow the science wherever it leads. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. The federal status of marijuana may be changing, and that could lead to an expansion of the cannabis market throughout the United States. Bloomberg News reported Wednesday that the Federal Department of Health and Human Services has sent a recommendation to the Drug Enforcement Agency to reclassify marijuana from its current Schedule 1, which is defined as having no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, to Schedule 3, defined as having a moderate or low potential for physical and psychological dependence. Health Secretary Javier Becerra has confirmed that a recommendation has been sent in accordance with a review ordered by President Biden, but he is not saying exactly what that recommendation is. The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked about this at her news conference this afternoon.
President Biden had campaigned on fully decriminalizing marijuana. Even if the DEA request goes through, marijuana would still be illegal at the federal level. Could you provide some more information on exactly what impact this would have on Americans?
I don't want to get ahead of the process. I was asked this question before, so just so that everybody's clear, the President asked the Secretary of HHS and also the Attorney General to initiate the administrative process to review how marijuana is scheduled, as you just kind of laid out. The administration process is an independent process. I want to be very clear on that. That is led by HHS and DOJ. It is going to be very much guided by evidence, and so I'm not going to comment on that. I want to be also clear on that piece. So I would refer you all to HHS as we speak to legalization and the legal piece of it, as you're asking me in part of your question. So look, the President has always supported the legalization of marijuana for medical purposes. He's been very clear about that. Where appropriate, consistent with medical and scientific evidence. That is why it is important for this review, this independent review, that is going to be, again, guided by evidence to go through. And so I'm just not going to get ahead of what HHS is going to, the decision that they've made, or get ahead of eventually what the DOJ is going to move forward with.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. Natalie Furtig is a federal cannabis policy reporter for Politico and has been following this story. Joined us now by phone. Thank you so much. Some reports say that the recommendation from the Health and Human Services Department is for cannabis to go from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Hasn't been confirmed officially. If that were to happen, what changes would happen in laws and regulations pertaining to cannabis?
Yeah, so if the DEA decides to go through with what is being reported as the HHS's recommendation, it could create some pretty big changes for the existing cannabis industry. There are big prohibitions right now on Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs and what they can write off on taxes. So even though cannabis is legal in some states, a cannabis dispensary can't write off payroll. If they became a Schedule 3 drug, they could suddenly write off payroll. They would be paying less federal taxes, and a lot of cannabis companies have said that would really help them get out of the red and into profitability, which has been a surprisingly hard thing to do given the green rush that happened quite a couple of years ago in a bunch of different states. The thing it would not do, and I think this is kind of being missed sometimes between the lines, is that it's not going to have major impacts on criminal code, because federal criminal code specifically lists cannabis. It doesn't say Schedule I drugs have these penalties. It says cannabis or marijuana has these penalties, and that would take an act of Congress to change.
I was going to ask you next about the role of Congress. So Congress would change the criminal law, but about this simply moving from Schedule I to Schedule III, does Congress have a role in that?
So Congress can also instruct the DEA to remove it from the CSA or the Controlled Substances Act entirely. The CSA was originally passed by Congress and signed by President Nixon in 1970. So both the agency and Congress do have power over it. There was always a suspicion when President Biden announced that he wanted HHS and the DEA to go through this process of looking at the available research on cannabis and suggesting and potentially rescheduling it, that it was going to be a reschedule versus a deschedule, which would have been completely removing it from the Controlled Substances Act. If it were to be descheduled or federally decriminalized in the future, that would likely happen through an act of Congress versus through this HHS DEA process.
Two questions regarding descheduling then. What level of support is there in Congress for doing that? And why do you think that the Health and Human Services Department didn't recommend full deschedule?
So everything, I'm going to answer your second question first. All of my knowledge about the HHS process is that it is a purely scientific process. They have 8 different points that they are supposed to look at. They're supposed to go through available research. That was very clearly defined in President Biden's executive order, was available research, and then look at 8 different things to determine both the abuse potential of a drug and the medical potential of a drug. And then those two things kind of come together into one of 5 different schedules. HHS is not, ultimately that's the deciding factor on the scheduling. Alcohol is a drug of abuse, but it's not on a schedule. That's a political decision. That's a decision that was made by, an amendment to the Constitution almost 100 years ago to remove it or to make it legal federally, even though it could technically be a scheduled drug by the definitions of those different schedules. Same with nicotine. But in Congress, to answer now your first question, there is appetite in Congress to decriminalize, but in the Senate, you need 60 votes. And there are not actually, according to our last whips as reporters, even 50. Not all Democrats are actually on board with decriminalization. I spoke to a couple Democrats from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen, for example, and Hassan. Both of them said that they were not fully on board with decriminalization. And also Senator Tester from Montana, which is a state that has legal cannabis, has said that he's not sure that he would support federal decriminalization at this time. So they've got to get all the Democrats on board, and then they've got to convince 10 Republicans to support it as well. And they're definitely not there.
What's the timeline for what happened this week, the recommendation going from HHS to DEA? How long will it take to get to the end of this?
I really wish I had an answer to that question. I'm still working to figure that out myself. We were not sure exactly how long the HHS process would take. It took 11 months. The DEA process could be a month. It could be 6 months. I've heard rumor, there's rumor out there that it could come in the fall or sometime next year. But there were rumors a month ago that the HHS decision wasn't going to come out till next year. So it's, the DEA plays things pretty close to the chest, but, hopefully we'll get a little bit more insight into that here soon.
Natalie Furtig is a federal cannabis policy reporter for Politico. You can find her stories at Politico.com and on X, formerly Twitter, at NatsFurt. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
The Senate Finance Committee Chair, Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, issued a statement calling for marijuana to be completely descheduled, but Concerning the recommendation to loosen the rules, he said that the recommendation of HHS to reschedule cannabis as a Schedule III drug is not inconsequential. If HHS's recommendation is ultimately implemented, it will be a historic step for a nation whose cannabis policies have been out of touch with reality. And NBC News reports that some Republicans, including Florida's Matt Gaetz, Greg Steube, and Brian Mast, have publicly called on the drug to be rescheduled and urged the Biden administration to prioritize the effort. But on the presidential campaign trail, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis doubled down this week on his opposition to marijuana decriminalization and legalization, despite voters in his state legalizing medical use of the drug last year. That from NBC News. A story from the Tennessean newspaper in Nashville. Tennessee's special legislative session, held in the shadow of the worst school shooting in state history, ended Tuesday with no significant changes to the state's gun laws and only a narrow slate of bills sending more money toward public safety issues. In a minute, we'll talk with one of the reporters on that story, Melissa Brown. First, this is what it sounded like on Tuesday in the Tennessee House chamber when the Republican majority moved to adjourn the special session and the Democratic state representatives and their supporters in the gallery protested.
I hereby declare the first extraordinary session of the House of Representatives of the 113th General Assembly of the State of Tennessee sine die.
Tennessee House of Representatives on Tuesday. State Representative Justin Jones, a Democratic lawmaker who's been advocating for gun violence prevention legislation, was interviewed on MSNBC on Wednesday.
What you saw was chaos. The speaker ended session in chaos, and he wants us to focus on that chaos because he does not want us to focus on the chaos in our classrooms, in our schoolhouses, in our universities, and grocery stores, the chaos of mass shootings. What happened was that the speaker once again silenced any member from my caucus from speaking because they had an orchestrated, predetermined plan to end session, which means we don't return until January without hearing the voices of any other lawmaker because they were afraid of the movement, the people in the galleries, the mothers who came throughout the special session demanding common sense gun legislation to protect kids and not guns. And what you saw was a speaker who ran away from the people, who ran away from his colleagues, and who thinks that he's an authoritarian and who does not want to be held accountable by the public or by the legislative body of which he is a part.
State Representative Justin Jones on MSNBC on Wednesday. Melissa Brown, state government and politics reporter for the Tennessean, has been following the Tennessee legislative special session that ended this week and joins us now from Nashville. Thanks so much for being with us. Part of your article about this session reads that days of contentious committee meetings and a stubborn impasse between the two chambers were eye-opening to the messy, often dysfunctional nature of Tennessee politics for political newcomers who have been energized to act by the Covenant school shooting in March. Fill in the details. What happened and what didn't happen?
Definitely. As a reminder, 6 people were killed in that school shooting at a private Christian school in a pretty wealthy, pretty close to downtown Nashville neighborhood. There have, of course, been advocates for gun safety reform for years in Tennessee, which has seen an increasingly lax gun policy pushed by Republicans in the legislature and Republican governor. But I think the Covenant shooting really shocked a number of people into action who were concerned with the nature of gun policies in Tennessee. And a number of those people had really not been involved in politics and advocacy before. Maybe they were voters, things like that, but actually getting into the nitty-gritty of legislative politics in Tennessee where there is a Republican supermajority, I think was very eye-opening for people. I was, before the special session, I talked to dozens of voters across the state. I really wanted to get a sense of what voters wanted to see done, not just what the politicians in Nashville wanted to see done. And that was a familiar refrain from conservative Republicans, from, urban Democrats, from people really across a very diverse state, that they didn't necessarily feel heard by politicians in Nashville, and they were not incredibly optimistic about what might come out of the special session. And then I think we saw that happen over the last 2 weeks, maybe in really unexpected ways, particularly with the breakdown between the House and the Senate, and really no meaningful legislation that came out of an expensive special session that brought lawmakers back to the Capitol.
The governor of Tennessee, who is a Republican, called this special session. Why did he?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, you really have to go back to the Covenant shooting, where there were some personal impacts for the governor and his family. His wife, the First Lady, was very close friends with one of the victims of the shooting. And his family had been closely connected with that religious community, those private schools, for a very long time. And I don't think you can kind of undercount the impact that had on him, and maybe what he was hearing behind the scenes. He said, so the Covenant shooting happened sort of the tail end of the regular General Assembly session in the spring. And he came out toward the end of the session saying that he thought that Tennesseans deserved to vote on an extreme risk protection order law, which some people refer to as red flag laws. And lawmakers balked very quickly. Republican lawmakers did not want to take that up. And given some other political fireworks that were happening at the end of session, they moved very, very quickly to get out of town. And the governor came back very quickly and said he was going to call them back to take up that work. But over the summer, there was very little movement on taking up any sort of red flag or extreme risk proposals. And in the end, the governor did not have the votes to do that. And when he made the call for a special session, that extreme risk legislation wasn't even included in the measures that he was saying that he wanted to see done. So that push from him, which came out in April, really faltered over the summer, and he was not able to accomplish what he originally wanted to do.
We're talking with Melissa Brown, a reporter with the Tennessean. What will be the long-term impact on Tennessee politics from this special session, what happened over the past couple of months, and the gun violence issue in the state of Tennessee? Will it change anything?
It's really hard to say. We're just 2 days, about 48 hours exactly, removed from the special session adjourning. As I mentioned earlier, I do think that this was an eye-opening experience for some communities, some demographics of Tennesseans who may have not been incredibly involved in legislative politics and advocacy before. There was a great deal of emotion, frustration from members of the public who came out to watch the special session to speak to their lawmakers. Whether that energy is sustained the further and further we get from the inciting incident, which was the Covenant shooting and the tragic loss of those 6 lives, remains to be seen. I do think that there are concerns that the Republican supermajority is concerned from some people that they are legislating for the more extreme fringes of their party. And I think political experts will be keeping their eye on if there are more moderate conservatives who take on certain lawmakers in primaries, or even if the Democrats can flip a couple of seats. I don't think there would be, given how conservative the legislature is and how strong their supermajority is, it wouldn't immediately materially change the state legislature. But if we do see that in the next few election cycles, it might be a sign to lawmakers that public opinion has shifted, and that there is broader public opinion for additional gun reform, which we are seeing in various bipartisan polling right now. So that's sort of the long view. It's hard to say. We might get a bit more of a sense of it in January when the legislature comes back for their regular session. But I do think the more long-term view will be the upcoming election cycles, primaries, things like that.
Melissa Brown covers state government and politics for the Tennessean, joining us from Nashville. You can find her stories at Tennessean.com and on X, formerly Twitter, it's Melissa Brown. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
On Wall Street today, the Dow down 168, NASDAQ up 15, S&P down 7. Washington Post reports the White House on Thursday urged Congress to adopt a short-term measure to fund the federal government, a move meant to buy time for lawmakers to craft a broader spending deal and avert a shutdown at the end of September. The article continues, the Biden administration coupled its call to action with a new request that Congress address funding for a series of cash-starved programs, including, for example, an additional $1.4 billion to prevent a potential disruption in nutritional aid for low-income families. In this story from CNN, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas disclosed Thursday that Republican megadonor Harlan Crow paid for private jet trips for Justice Thomas in 2022 to attend a speech in Texas and a vacation at Harlan Crow's luxurious New York estate, as ethics questions continue to rock the Supreme Court. In one instance, says the article, Justice Thomas said he took the private transportation in May because of increased security risk following the leak of the Dobbs opinion overturning Roe v. Wade that had occurred a few days earlier. Newly released financial disclosure forms Thursday also amend prior reports to include information that had been inadvertently omitted, in quotes, from past forms, including a real estate deal between Justice Thomas and Harlan Crow back to 2014. Justice Thomas made the disclosures after receiving an extension to file the yearly reports that were originally due in May 2023, and Justice Samuel Alito released his financial disclosures Thursday as well. That from CNN. And thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.